You are afraid of the dark. You might not admit it. You might laugh and say no. I am not. I am a grown adult. I am not afraid of the dark. That is something children are afraid of. But you are. You are afraid of it in ways that you do not even recognize anymore, because the fear is so old, so deep, so woven into the fabric of your nervous system that it does not feel like fear. It feels like normal. It feels like the way things are. You walk into a dark room and your hand reaches for the light switch before your conscious mind has even registered that the room is dark. You do not think about it. You do not decide to do it. Your hand just moves, reaches, finds the switch, clicks, and the light comes on and the darkness vanishes, and the room is safe and known and ordinary, and you walk in without a second thought, and you never, not once, not ever, stop to consider what just happened. What just happened is that you performed a miracle so common, so routine, so thoroughly domesticated that it has become invisible. You summoned light. Instant, effortless, unlimited light. You banished darkness with the flick of a finger. And you did it without gratitude, without wonder, without any awareness at all that for the vast majority of human history, roughly 300,000 years, your ancestors could not do what you just did. They could not flick a switch. They could not push a button. They could not summon light from nothing. When darkness came, it stayed. It filled their world like water filling a bowl, complete, total, absolute, and the only thing standing between them and that darkness was fire. A small, fragile, temperamental, dangerous, precious, irreplaceable flame. And the story of how human beings learned to hold that flame, to carry it, to contain it, to shape it into something that could be placed on a table and trusted to burn through the night without setting the house on fire or going out, or filling the room with smoke so thick you could not breathe. That story is one of the longest and most important stories in human history, and almost nobody knows it. Almost nobody has ever stopped to think about it, because the light switch works. And when the light switch works, you do not need to think about candles. But tonight, I want you to think about candles. I want you to think about oil lamps and rushes and tallow and beeswax and whale oil and kerosene and gas and all the other ways that human beings across thousands of years fought back against the darkness that surrounded them every single night of their lives. Because the history of light is not just the history of a technology, it is the history of human civilization itself. Every advance in lighting changed how people lived, how they worked, how they socialized, how they worshipped, how they loved, how they governed, how they thought. The quality and quantity of light available to a society is one of the most fundamental determinants of how that society functions, and changes in lighting technology have triggered social transformations as profound as anything caused by war or revolution or the rise and fall of empires. And yet this history is almost completely invisible, hidden in plain sight, taken for granted, ignored, because light is so ubiquitous, so ordinary, so unremarkable in the modern world that it has become the one thing we never think about, until the power goes out. And then, suddenly, in the sudden shocking totality of unexpected darkness, you remember. You remember what your body has always known. But your mind has learned to forget. That darkness is the default. Light is the exception. That everything you take for granted, your ability to read, to work, to move safely through your home, to see the faces of the people you love, all of it depends on a technology that did not exist for most of human history and that, even now, is more fragile than you realize. So tonight, let me take you back to the beginning, back to a time before candles, before oil lamps, before any form of artificial light at all. Back to a darkness that you have never experienced and that you cannot truly imagine. Back to the first night. The first thing you need to understand about the ancient world is that the night was a different country. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, a literal, physical, experiential truth. When the sun went down in the prehistoric world, the world changed. Everything changed. The landscape that you knew, the familiar terrain of hills and rivers and trees and paths that you navigated confidently during the day became unrecognizable. Shapes dissolved. Colors vanished. Distances became impossible to judge. The tree that was a landmark during the day became a looming dark mass that could be a tree or a rock or a predator or nothing at all. The path that you walked every day became invisible, and the ground beneath your feet could hide roots and stones and holes and snakes and 1,000 other hazards that your eyes, adapted for daylight, could not detect. And the predators. This is the part that modern people forget because we have eliminated the predators from our world so thoroughly that we have forgotten they were ever there. But for most of human history, the night belonged to the predators. Lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves, snakes. The animals that hunted at night, the animals whose eyes were adapted for darkness, whose senses of smell and hearing were sharp enough to find prey in the pitch black, these animals owned the night. And humans, with their pathetic night vision, their slow-running speed, their soft bodies and their thin skin and their useless claws were prey. Actual prey. Not metaphorical prey. The kind of prey that gets eaten. The oldest human fear is the fear of the dark. And it is not irrational. It is not a childhood fantasy that we should grow out of. It is a survival instinct that was burned into our DNA by hundreds of thousands of years of being hunted in the darkness by things with sharper teeth and better eyes. The fear of the dark kept our ancestors alive, the ones who were not afraid of the dark, the ones who wandered away from the group at night, the ones who were brave or foolish or careless enough to venture into the darkness alone. Those ones were eaten, and they did not pass on their genes. The ones who survived, the ones who huddled together in the safety of the group, who kept their backs to a cliff wall or a cave mouth, who stayed close to the one thing that could keep the predators at bay, the fire. Those ones survived, and they passed on their fear to you. Fire was the first light. Not a lamp, not a candle, not a technology of any kind. Just fire. A burning branch, a pile of smouldering embers, a campfire built in the mouth of a cave or on a ledge of rock, its flickering orange light, pushing back the darkness just far enough to create a small circle of safety, a bubble of visibility in the vast, dark, dangerous night. The fire did not eliminate the darkness. It did not even come close. A campfire illuminates a circle perhaps 15 or 20 feet in diameter, and beyond that circle, the darkness is absolute. But within that circle, within that small, warm, flickering sphere of light, the world is transformed. You can see. You can see the ground. You can see the faces of the people around you. You can see the faces of the people around you. You can see the shapes of the rocks and the trees. And you can see, or at least you imagine you can see, the eyes of the predators at the edge of the light, watching, waiting, kept at bay by the flames. The control of fire is the oldest and most important technology in human history, older than the wheel, older than agriculture, older than language possibly, though that is debated. The earliest evidence of controlled fire use dates to at least 400,000 years ago, and some researchers argue for dates as far back as 1,000,000 years or more. Fire gave our ancestors warmth in cold climates. Fire gave them the ability to cook food, which increased the nutritional value of their diet, and may have driven the expansion of the human brain. Fire gave them protection from predators. And fire gave them light. But fire has a problem. A fundamental, inescapable, deeply inconvenient problem. Fire is not portable. You cannot pick up a campfire and carry it with you. You cannot put a campfire on a shelf. You cannot hold a campfire in your hand while you walk through a dark cave to see the paintings on the walls. Fire, in its natural form, is stationary. It stays where you build it. And if you need light somewhere else, if you need to see in a place where there is no fire, you have a problem. And this problem, this simple, practical, everyday problem of how to carry light from one place to another, is the problem that launched the entire history of lighting technology. Every candle, every lamp, every lantern, every gas jet, every electric bulb, every LED, every form of artificial light that has ever existed, is, at its core, an answer to this one question: how do you make fire portable? The first answer was the most obvious one. You pick up a burning stick from the fire and carry it. A torch, a branch with one end burning, held in the hand, casting a small, unsteady, smoky light that allows you to see a few feet ahead of you in the darkness. The torch is the oldest form of portable light, and it was used by human beings for tens of thousands of years. The cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira and Chauvet, those magnificent works of art that were created deep inside limestone caves 15,000 to 35,000 years ago, were painted by the light of torches. We know this because archaeologists have found the remains of the torches on the cave floors, charred stumps of juniper and pine, along with the soot marks on the cave ceilings where the torch smoke blackened the stone. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine walking into the absolute darkness of a deep limestone cave, a darkness so complete that it is like being blind, carrying nothing but a burning stick, and by the flickering, unsteady, smoky light of that stick, painting a horse on the wall, painting it so beautifully, with such skill and such attention to the curve of the neck and the line of the leg and the texture of the mane, that 30,000 years later, people would travel from the other side of the world to see it. That is what our ancestors did with a burning stick, and if that does not fill you with awe, I do not know what will. But the torch has limitations. It burns fast. A wooden torch lasts perhaps 30 minutes to an hour before it burns down to a stub too short and too hot to hold. It smokes heavily, filling enclosed spaces with choking fumes. It drips burning embers and sparks. It requires one hand to hold, leaving only one hand free for other tasks, and it cannot be set down on a flat surface because it will either roll and set the floor on fire or go out from lack of air circulation. The torch is better than nothing, but it is a long way from a candle. The next step in the history of light was the discovery that certain materials burn more slowly and more steadily than wood. And the most important of these materials, the material that would dominate human lighting for thousands of years, was fat. Animal fat. Here is something that you probably do not think about very often. Fat burns. Animal fat, the white, greasy, solid substance that surrounds the organs and lines the body cavities of mammals, is flammable. If you hold a flame to a piece of animal fat, it will melt, and the liquid fat will ignite and burn with a steady, relatively bright, yellowish flame. And this is not a small, feeble flame. A lump of animal fat, properly arranged with a wick to draw the melted fat upward into the flame, can burn for hours. Hours. Not the 30 minutes of a wooden torch. Hours. Nobody knows exactly when or where human beings first discovered that animal fat could be used as a fuel for light. The discovery was probably made independently many times in many places over tens of thousands of years. It may have been an accidental discovery, noticed by someone who dropped a piece of fat into a campfire and watched it burn with a bright, steady flame. Or it may have been a deliberate experiment, made by someone who is looking for a way to extend the life of a fire or to create a portable light source. We do not know. What we do know is that by at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier, human beings were using animal fat as a fuel for light. The earliest fat lamps are breathtakingly simple. They are nothing more than a hollow stone, a natural depression in a piece of rock filled with animal fat, with a strip of some absorbent material, a piece of dried moss, a twist of plant fiber, a strip of animal hide laid across the edge of the stone with one end submerged in the fat and the other end hanging over the edge. The submerged end of the wick absorbs the liquid fat, drawing it upward through capillary action, and the exposed end is lit. The fat burns at the tip of the wick, producing a small steady flame that will continue to burn as long as there is fat to draw and wick to burn. These stone fat lamps have been found at prehistoric sites across Europe and Asia, dating back at least 15,000 years. The famous caves of Lascaux, which I mentioned earlier, contain several stone lamps, carved from sandstone and limestone, with shallow bowls for holding the fat and channels for the wick. Analysis of the residue in these lamps shows that the fuel was animal fat, probably from reindeer or horse or bison, the large game animals that the cave painters hunted. So the same people who painted those magnificent horses and bulls and deer on the cave walls also invented one of the first artificial light sources in human history. The artist and the engineer were the same person. Now if you are lying in the dark right now thinking about a cave painter squatting in the bowels of a limestone cave 15,000 years ago holding a crude stone lamp filled with reindeer fat, painting by the light of a flame no brighter than a birthday candle, then you are already beginning to understand something important about the history of light. You are beginning to understand how little light our ancestors had to work with. A stone fat lamp produces perhaps 1/10 of the light of a single modern candle. 1/10. You would need 10 of these lamps burning simultaneously to equal the light of one candle. And you would need roughly 100 candles to equal the light of a single 60-watt incandescent light bulb. And you would need perhaps 1,000 light bulbs to equal the light that floods your kitchen when you flip the switch. The amount of light available to a cave painter, the amount of light in which those magnificent artworks were created, was so small by modern standards that you would struggle to find your way across a room by it. And yet the paintings are masterpieces, which tells you something not just about the skill of the painters, but about the adaptability of the human eye. In darkness, the human eye undergoes a process called dark adaptation, in which the pupil dilates and the rod cells in the retina become more sensitive, allowing you to see in light conditions that would seem impossibly dim if you stepped into them directly from a brightly lit room. A fully dark-adapted human eye can detect a single candle flame from over a mile away on a clear night. And by the light of a fat lamp, a dark-adapted eye can see well enough to paint, to sew, to prepare food, to recognize faces, to do almost anything that requires vision, albeit slowly and with difficulty. Your ancestors were not stumbling around in the dark. They were adapted to it. They were comfortable in it, or at least as comfortable as anyone can be when the alternative is no light at all. And the crude stone fat lamp, for all its limitations, was a technology that transformed their relationship with darkness. It gave them light that they could control, light that they could carry, light that they could set down on a surface and leave burning while they used both hands for other tasks, light that lasted hours instead of minutes, light that did not require a bonfire, light that could be used inside a cave, inside a tent, inside any enclosed space, without filling it with the choking smoke of a wooden torch. But animal fat has its own problems as a fuel, and the biggest problem is the smell. Burning animal fat stinks. There is no polite way to say it. The combustion of animal fat produces a thick, greasy, pungent smoke that smells like, well, like burning animal fat, like a greasy kitchen fire, like a barbecue gone wrong. The smell gets into everything. It permeates clothes, hair, skin, walls, furniture. A room that has been lit by animal fat lamps for any length of time reeks of it, and the smell lingers for days. This might not seem like a significant issue, and for prehistoric people who lived in caves and tents and were accustomed to the smells of butchery and cooking and unwashed bodies, it probably was not. But as human societies became more settled, more domestic, more concerned with comfort and cleanliness and the subtle social distinctions that separate the wealthy from the poor, the smell of burning fat became a problem, a mark of poverty, a sign that you could not afford anything better, and the desire for something better, something that burned cleaner and smelled less terrible, drove the next stage in the history of light. But before we get to candles, I want to tell you about an intermediate technology that is almost completely forgotten today, but that was, for centuries, the primary source of artificial light for the ordinary people of Europe. I want to tell you about the rushlight. A rushlight is exactly what it sounds like. It is a light made from a rush. A rush is a tall, slender marsh plant common throughout the wetlands and riverbanks of northern Europe, with a spongy pith at its center that is surrounded by a tough outer skin. To make a rushlight, you gather rushes in the late summer when they are fully grown, peel away the outer skin, leaving just a thin strip of skin along one side to give the pith some structural support, and then dry the peeled rush. Once it is dry, you dip it in melted animal fat, usually saved from cooking, coating the spongy pith with a layer of grease. You let the fat solidify, and then you have a rushlight. To use it, you clamp the rushlight at an angle in a special holder, a simple iron clip mounted on a wooden base, and you light the upper end. The fat-soaked pith burns slowly, producing a small, flickering flame that gives about the same amount of light as a single birthday candle. A rushlight about a foot long will burn for roughly 15 to 20 minutes, which means that a family's supply of evening light depends on having a large stock of prepared rushlights ready to use, one after another, throughout the long winter evenings. The rushlight was the light of the poor. It was cheap, almost free, because the raw materials, rushes and cooking fat, cost nothing. Any family that lived near a marsh or a riverbank could gather rushes, and every family, no matter how poor, had some animal fat saved from cooking. The rushlight required no special tools, no special skills, no purchased materials. It was a light source that was accessible to everyone, from the poorest cottager to the most remote farmstead. And for centuries, from the early Middle Ages well into the 18th century, the rushlight was the primary source of artificial light for the vast majority of the population of Northern Europe. The poet and naturalist Gilbert White, writing in the late 18th century about the village of Selborne in Hampshire, described the rushlight in detail and noted that a family could produce a year's supply of rushlights in a single day's work, gathering and peeling the rushes in the morning and dipping them in fat in the afternoon. He calculated that a rushlight an inch in circumference would burn for about 28 minutes, and that a pound of fat would provide enough dipping material for about 1,600 hours of light, which was more economical than any other form of lighting available to the rural poor. But the rushlight had obvious limitations. The light it produced was dim, very dim. A single rushlight provided barely enough light to eat by, and reading or close hand work by rushlight was a strain on the eyes that could lead to headaches and, over time, permanent damage to vision. The flame was unsteady, flickering with every draught, and the rushlight had to be constantly adjusted in its holder to maintain the correct burning angle. If it tilted too far to one side, the flame would gutter and go out. If it tilted too far to the other, the fat would melt and drip and the rush would burn too fast. Managing a rushlight was a constant, fiddly, annoying task that fell, like most domestic tasks, to the women of the household. And now, I want to take you somewhere else entirely. I want to take you to the ancient Mediterranean, to the world of Greece and Rome, because it was in the Mediterranean world that the next great advance in lighting technology occurred, an advance that would transform the quality of artificial light, and that would remain the standard for over 2,000 years. I want to tell you about the oil lamp. The oil lamp is a fundamentally different technology from the fat lamp. Both use a wick to draw liquid fuel into a flame. But the fuel is different, and the difference matters enormously. Instead of solid animal fat, which must be rendered and which burns with a smoky, smelly flame, the oil lamp uses liquid vegetable oil. And in the Mediterranean world, the vegetable oil of choice was olive oil. Olive oil is, from a lighting perspective, a nearly perfect fuel. It is liquid at room temperature, which means it does not need to be melted before it can be drawn up the wick. It burns with a bright, steady, relatively clean flame that produces much less smoke and much less smell than animal fat. It is readily available in the Mediterranean region, where olive trees grow abundantly, and olive oil is produced in vast quantities for cooking and personal hygiene. And it is safe. Olive oil has a high flash point, which means it does not ignite easily. You can drop a burning match into a bowl of olive oil and the match will go out. The oil will not catch fire. This makes olive oil lamps much safer than animal fat lamps, which use a fuel that is more volatile and more prone to flare-ups and spills. The ancient Greeks and Romans developed the oil lamp into a highly refined technology. The earliest Greek oil lamps, dating to about the 7th century BCE, were simple open bowls with a pinched rim to hold the wick, not much different in principle from the prehistoric stone fat lamps. But over the following centuries, the design evolved into something much more sophisticated. By the Roman period, oil lamps were being mass-produced in pottery workshops across the empire, turned out by the thousands in standardized molds, in a range of sizes and designs to suit every budget and every purpose. A typical Roman oil lamp is a small enclosed ceramic vessel, roughly the size and shape of your palm, with a small filling hole in the top for adding oil and a nozzle at the front where the wick protrudes. The wick is usually made of linen or papyrus fiber, twisted into a cord and threaded through the nozzle so that one end sits in the oil reservoir and the other end extends out of the nozzle where it can be lit. The enclosed design is a significant improvement over the open bowl lamp because it reduces evaporation of the oil, reduces the risk of spills, and allows the lamp to be carried and moved without sloshing oil everywhere. If you have been traveling with me through this story, if you have been lying in the dark thinking about cave painters and rushlights and the smell of burning animal fat, then you're beginning to understand something that I think is very important about the history of technology. You are beginning to understand that progress is not a straight line. It is not a smooth, inevitable march from primitive to advanced. It is messy and uneven, and full of dead ends and detours and regional variations. The oil lamp was a brilliant technology that was widely available in the Mediterranean world by 500 BCE. But in Northern Europe, where olive trees do not grow and where olive oil was an expensive imported luxury, people continued to use rushlights and animal fat lamps for another 2,000 years. The technology existed, the knowledge was there, but the raw materials were not, and without the raw materials, the technology was useless. Geography determined lighting technology just as surely as it determined agriculture and diet and building methods and every other aspect of daily life. A Roman citizen in the 1st century CE had access to light that was brighter, cleaner, and more convenient than anything available to an English peasant in the 15th century, 1400 years later. Progress is not a straight line. Roman oil lamps were not just functional, they were beautiful. The surfaces of Roman lamps were decorated with molded reliefs depicting an astonishing range of subjects. Mythological scenes, gladiatorial combats, erotic encounters, animals, plants, geometric patterns. The lamps were small works of art, handled and admired and displayed as well as used, and the imagery on them provides a fascinating window into the visual culture of the Roman world. Some lamps were plain and cheap, the mass-produced, undecorated equivalents of a disposable flashlight. Others were elaborate and expensive, made from bronze or silver, with multiple nozzles for multiple wicks, producing a light that, while still dim by modern standards, was brighter and more reliable than anything most people had ever seen. And the oil lamp changed Roman life in ways that went far beyond the practical. The availability of reliable, affordable artificial light extended the useful day beyond sunset. Romans could and did work, socialize, eat, drink, read, write, and conduct business after dark in a way that would have been impossible without the oil lamp. The Roman dinner party, the cena, which was the principal meal of the day and the main social event for the Roman upper class, typically began in the late afternoon and continued well into the evening by lamplight. The conversation, the wine, the food, the entertainment, all of it took place under the warm golden glow of olive oil lamps, and the quality of the lamps, the number of lamps, the brightness and the beauty of the light was a marker of the host's wealth and status. The Roman poet Martial, writing in the 1st century CE, complained about the poor quality of the lamps at a stingy friend's dinner party, noting that the lamps were so few and so dim that the guests could barely see their food. This tells us two things. First, that the brightness of the lighting at a social gathering was a matter of social importance, a marker of generosity and refinement. And second, that even in the Roman world, even at the height of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, artificial light was still scarce enough to be a status symbol. Light was a luxury, not a necessity, not a given, a luxury. Something that the wealthy had more of and the poor had less of, something that could be displayed or withheld, something that mattered. And this is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of lighting, all the way up to the modern era. At every stage of the technology, light is unequally distributed. The rich have more, the poor have less. And the amount of light you have access to is not just a measure of your wealth, it is a determinant of your quality of life. More light means more hours of productive work. More light means more opportunities for education, for reading, for intellectual activity. More light means more social connection, more evening gatherings, more time with family and friends. More light means more safety, because crimes are committed in the dark and accidents happen in the dark and disease spreads in the dark. The history of light is a history of inequality. And the democratization of light, the process by which artificial light went from being a luxury of the wealthy to being a basic utility available to everyone, is one of the great unsung stories of human progress. But that democratization took thousands of years, and we are only at the beginning. If this story has been illuminating, and I do mean that in every sense of the word, then I want to ask you to do something that takes less time than it took a Roman servant to fill an oil lamp. Subscribe to this channel. That is it. One tap, one click, and you become a permanent companion on this journey through the history of the ordinary things that made the world. Because this is what I do. I tell the stories of the things you never think about, the things that are so common, so familiar, so ordinary that they have become invisible. Candles, lamps, bread, salt, water, shoes, doors, windows, the things that everyone uses and no one notices. And these stories, these quiet, calm, unglamorous stories, are the real history of the human race. Not the kings and the battles, the candles and the bread. If that sounds like the kind of history you want to hear, then subscribe and leave a comment telling me which ordinary object you want me to explore next. A fork, a mirror, a key, a bed. Everything has a history, everything has a story, and I want to tell all of them. Hit the like button too, because every like tells me that these quiet stories deserve to be heard, and it tells the algorithm the same thing, and together, you and me and the algorithm, we can make sure that the history of candles gets the same attention as the history of kings. Now let me take you back to the ancient world one more time, because I have not yet told you about the most remarkable thing about ancient lighting. And the most remarkable thing is not the technology, it is the darkness. Even in the Roman world, even in the most brilliantly lit Roman house, even at the most lavish dinner party with dozens of lamps blazing on every surface, the light was dim. Extraordinarily dim by modern standards. A well-lit Roman room with 20 or 30 oil lamps burning simultaneously would have produced roughly the same amount of light as a single modern table lamp, a single 40-watt bulb. That is all. And outside the room, beyond the lamplight, the darkness was total. Roman streets were not lit. There were no street lamps, no public lighting of any kind. When you stepped out of a Roman house at night, you stepped into a darkness that modern city dwellers have never experienced. A darkness so complete that you could not see the ground beneath your feet. You could not see the walls of the buildings on either side. You could not see the people walking toward you until they were close enough to touch. Roman cities at night were dangerous places. Robbery, assault, and murder were common after dark, and the Roman satirists are full of warnings about the hazards of nighttime travel through the city streets. Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, described the dangers of walking through Rome at night in vivid and terrifying detail, warning his readers about muggers and drunks and people who threw the contents of their chamber pots out of upper-story windows onto the heads of passers-by. The only protection was to travel with a bodyguard or to carry your own light, a torch or a lantern, which announced your presence but also made you a target, because a light in the darkness advertised that you were someone worth robbing. The ancient world lived in a darkness that we cannot imagine, and the small, flickering, smoky, smelly, precious flames that held that darkness at bay. The fat lamps and the oil lamps and the rushlights and the torches were not just technologies, they were lifelines. They were the thin, fragile barrier between the human world and the dark world, between civilization and chaos, between safety and danger, between seeing and being blind. And the people who used them, who tended them, who filled them and trimmed them and lit them and carried them, understood this in a way that we, with our unlimited electricity and our 24-hour daylight, can never fully understand. The flame was sacred. In almost every ancient culture, fire and light are associated with the divine. The eternal flame in the Temple of Vesta in Rome, tended by the Vestal Virgins, was a symbol of the Roman state itself, and allowing it to go out was a crime punishable by death. The menorah in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was lit with olive oil and was one of the most sacred objects in Jewish worship. The Hindu festival of Diwali, the festival of lights, celebrates the triumph of light over darkness, of good over evil, of knowledge over ignorance. The Christian tradition places candles on the altar and lights them during worship, and the Paschal candle, lit at Easter, symbolizes the resurrection of Christ and the triumph of life over death. Light is not just useful. Light is holy. And this association between light and the divine is not arbitrary. It is rooted in the deepest human experience. For hundreds of thousands of years, light was the one thing that stood between human beings and the terror of the night. Light was safety. Light was survival. Light was the difference between life and death. And so when human beings began to create gods and develop religions, they made their gods from the same material that had saved them from the dark. They made their gods from light. And on that thought, on the thought of light as salvation, as the sacred flame that holds back the darkness that our ancestors feared more than anything else in the world, I want to pause. Not because the story is over. It is far from over. We have not yet reached the candle, and the candle is where the story truly begins to transform. We have not yet met the chandler, and the beekeeper, and the whaler, and the lamplighter, and the inventor, and all the other characters in this extraordinary history. We have not yet witnessed the revolution that happened when cities began to glow at night for the first time, or the counter-revolution that is happening now as we begin to realize what we have lost by killing the darkness. All of that is ahead of us. The night is long, the story is longer, and the flame is still burning. Let it burn. The candle was not invented. I need you to understand that because it changes how you think about the whole story. Nobody sat down one day and said, I am going to invent the candle. Nobody had a eureka moment. Nobody filed a patent. The candle emerged. Slowly. Gradually. Over centuries. Slowly. Out of the accumulated experience of thousands of anonymous people who were trying to solve the same problem that every human being faced every night of their lives. How do I make the darkness go away? And the candle, when it finally appeared in a form that you would recognize, was not a breakthrough. It was a refinement. A long, slow, incremental refinement of the same basic principle that the cave painters had used 15,000 years earlier. A fuel. A wick. A flame. That is all a candle is. That is all a candle is. That is all a candle has ever been. And yet the difference between a stow lamp filled with reindeer fat and a properly made beeswax candle with a braided cotton wick is the difference between a dirt trek and a highway. The principle is the same. The experience is entirely different. The first true candles, or at least the first objects that we would recognize as candles rather than lamps, appeared somewhere around 2,000 years ago, though the exact date and place of origin are lost. The Romans used a form of candle made from tallow, which is rendered animal fat, moulded around a central wick of twisted papyrus or rush pith. The Chinese made candles from whale fat and later from insect wax and plant wax, with wicks made from rolled rice paper. The Indians used wax from boiled cinnamon tree bark. Every culture that had access to a solid fuel that could be moulded around a wick eventually developed something that could be called a candle. But the candle that dominated European life for over 1,000 years, the candle that lit the homes of kings and peasants and priests and merchants and criminals and lovers and scholars and everyone in between, was the tallow candle. And the tallow candle was terrible. I do not mean that it was bad in the way that a cheap flashlight is bad, dim and unreliable, but basically functional. I mean that the tallow candle was a genuinely unpleasant object to use, and the fact that people used it for centuries tells you something important about how desperate they were for light. Because tallow, as a candle fuel, has a problem that I've already mentioned, but that I need to emphasize again because it is central to understanding the social history of light in the Middle Ages and beyond. Tallow smells. It smells when it is being rendered. It smells when it is being molded into candles. It smells when it is burning. And it smells when it goes out, producing a thick, greasy, acrid wisp of smoke that catches in the throat and makes the eyes water. The smell of a burning tallow candle is the smell of cooking fat, but worse. Imagine the smell of a frying pan that has been left on the stove too long, the fat smoking and beginning to burn, that sharp, nauseating, greasy smell that fills the kitchen and clings to everything. Now imagine that smell as a constant presence in your home, every evening for hours, because the tallow candle on your table is producing it steadily, filling the room with a faint but inescapable odor of burning animal fat that gets into your clothes, your hair, your bedding, your food. That is what artificial light smelled like for most people for most of history. When you think of a candlelit dinner, you probably imagine something romantic and atmospheric. Warm golden light, soft shadows, a sense of intimacy and occasion. But the reality of a dinner lit by tallow candles was very different. The light was dim and yellow and unsteady. The air was thick with the greasy smell of burning fat, and the candles themselves were dripping, sputtering, smoking things that required constant attention, constant trimming, constant adjustment to keep them burning properly. And the smoke. Tallow candles produce a lot of smoke, much more than modern paraffin candles, and the smoke deposits a fine layer of greasy soot on everything in the room. Walls, ceilings, furniture, paintings, books, all of them gradually acquire a dark, oily film from the tallow smoke, and this film is almost impossible to clean without damaging the surface beneath it. The blackened ceilings of medieval and early modern buildings are often attributed to the hearth fire, and the hearth certainly contributed, but the tallow candles were a significant factor as well. If you lived in a house lit by tallow candles, your ceiling was black. But the tallow candle had one enormous advantage that outweighed all of its disadvantages. It was cheap. Tallow was rendered from the fat of cattle and sheep, animals that were slaughtered in large numbers in every medieval community, and the fat was a byproduct that would otherwise be wasted. The rendering process is straightforward. The raw fat is cut into small pieces, heated slowly in a large pot until it melts, and then strained through cloth to remove the solid bits of membrane and connective tissue, called cracklings. The resulting liquid tallow is clean and uniform, and it solidifies as it cools into a smooth, white, waxy substance that can be molded into candles. The simplest method of making tallow candles is dipping. We take a wick, which in the medieval period was usually made from rush pith or loosely twisted cotton or linen fibers, and you dip it repeatedly into a pot of melted tallow, allowing each coat to cool and solidify before dipping again. Layer by layer, the tallow builds up around the wick, creating a cylinder of fuel with a wick at its center. A candle made by dipping is slightly irregular, slightly tapered, slightly lumpy but functional, and a skilled chandler working quickly and methodically could produce dozens of candles in a single session. Dipping multiple wicks at once on a frame or a rack, building up the candles in assembly-line fashion. The alternative method is molding. Liquid tallow is poured into a mold, usually made of metal, with the wick suspended in the center and left to cool and solidify. Malted candles are more uniform and more attractive than ditch candles, but they require an investment in molds, which are expensive, and the process is slower. Molding became more common in the later medieval period and into the early modern era, but dipping remained the standard method for cheap everyday candles well into the 19th century. Now, if tallow candles were the light of the common people, the light of the poor and the middling and the merely comfortable, then there was another kind of candle for the rich. A candle that burned brighter. A candle that burned cleaner. A candle that did not smell. A candle that did not smoke. A candle that was, by every measure except price, vastly superior to tallow. That candle was made from beeswax. Beeswax is produced by honeybees. The worker bees secrete it from glands on the underside of their abdomens in the form of tiny, transparent flakes, and they use it to build the hexagonal cells of the honeycomb in which they store honey and raise their young. Beeswax is a remarkable substance. It is hard and smooth at room temperature. It has a high melting point, higher than tallow, which means beeswax candles hold their shape better and drip less. It burns with a bright, steady, clean flame that produces almost no smoke and no unpleasant odor. In fact, burning beeswax produces a faint, sweet, honey-like scent that is one of the most pleasant smells in the world. And beeswax candles last longer than tallow candles of the same size, because beeswax has a higher energy density, meaning it contains more combustible material per unit of weight. A beeswax candle is, in every practical sense, a superior product. The light is brighter. The flame is steadier. The burning is cleaner. The smell is better. The dripping is less. The smut is negligible. The candle is simply better. And this has been known for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians used beeswax candles. The Romans used beeswax candles. Every culture that kept honeybees understood that beeswax produced a better candle than animal fat. But beeswax has a fatal flaw, at least from the perspective of the ordinary person trying to light their home. It is expensive, extremely expensive. A pound of beeswax in medieval England cost roughly 10 to 12 times as much as a pound of tallow. This is not a small price difference. This is a difference so large that it puts beeswax candles completely out of reach for the vast majority of the population. A peasant farmer who could afford a few tallow candles for the winter evenings could not possibly afford beeswax. Beeswax was for the wealthy, for the aristocracy, for the church. And it is the church that brings us to what I think is one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of light. Because the medieval Christian church did not just use beeswax candles, it required them. By ecclesiastical law, the candles used on the altar during the celebration of the Mass were required to be made of beeswax, not tallow, not any other material. Beeswax. The reason was theological. Beeswax was considered a pure substance produced by the virgin bee, the worker bee, which medieval people believed reproduced without mating. The purity of the wax was seen as a symbol of the purity of Christ's flesh, born of the Virgin Mary. The flame of the beeswax candle was a symbol of Christ's divine nature, and the wick was a symbol of Christ's divine nature, and the wick was a symbol of Christ's human soul. The candle, in other words, was not just a light source, it was a theological object, a physical embodiment of Christian doctrine, and every time a beeswax candle was lit on the altar, it was a statement of faith. This theological requirement had enormous economic consequences. The church was the largest consumer of beeswax in medieval Europe. Every church, every chapel, every cathedral, every monastery, every convent, every shrine needed beeswax candles for its liturgical services. The demand was colossal, and it drove a thriving trade in beeswax that stretched across the continent. Beeswax was imported from the forests of Eastern Europe, particularly from Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, where vast forests supported enormous populations of wild and semi-domesticated bees. The beeswax trade was one of the major commercial enterprises of the medieval Baltic region, and the merchant guilds that controlled it were among the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in Northern Europe. And the church did not just use beeswax candles during services, it used them constantly. Candles burned before the altar day and night. Candles burned before the statues of saints. Candles burned in the sacristy, in the vestry, in the chapter house, in the cloister. The amount of beeswax consumed by a single large cathedral in a year was staggering. Westminster Abbey in the 15th century consumed over 2,000 pounds of beeswax annually, just for liturgical purposes. 2,000 pounds. That is a ton of beeswax. And Westminster Abbey was just one of thousands of churches across Europe, all of them burning beeswax candles, all of them contributing to a demand for beeswax that drove prices up and kept the Baltic trade routes humming. The visual effect of all this beeswax was extraordinary. A medieval cathedral lit for a major feast day, with hundreds of beeswax candles burning on the altar, on the rood screen, in the chandeliers, in the wall sconces, in the hands of the congregation, was a spectacle of light that would have been overwhelming to people who lived most of their lives in near darkness. The golden light of the beeswax flames reflected off the gold leaf of the altarpieces, the jewelled reliquaries, the polished brass of the candelabra, the coloured glass of the windows, created an effect that was deliberately, consciously, purposefully designed to evoke the glory of heaven. The cathedral was heaven on earth, and the light was a foretaste of divine radiance. For a medieval peasant, entering a cathedral lit for Christmas or Easter, coming in from the cold, dark, smoky, tallow-scented world of the village into this blazing palace of golden light and sweet-smelling beeswax, the experience must have been genuinely transcendent. And this is where the history of light intersects with the history of power. Because light was not just a practical commodity, it was a symbol of wealth, of status, of divine favor. The king's hall blazed with beeswax candles, while the peasant's cottage flickered with a rushlight. The cathedral glowed with the pure sweet light of beeswax, while the parish church made do with a few tallow stubs. The amount of light you had was a measure of how important you were, how close to God you were, how high you stood in the great chain of being that medieval theology placed at the center of its understanding of the world. If you are finding that the history of something as simple as a candle is revealing things about human society that you never expected, then you understand why I make these videos. Because the history of ordinary things is never ordinary. Every object you take for granted has a story that reaches back centuries or millennia, and every one of those stories is tangled up with economics and religion and social class and technology and human nature in ways that are endlessly fascinating. And if you want to keep hearing these stories, if you want to stay on this journey through the hidden histories of the things you use every day, then the simplest thing you can do is subscribe. One tap, one click, and you are part of this. You are a fellow traveler on this path through the quiet, overlooked, surprisingly beautiful history of everyday life. Leave a comment too. Tell me something I do not know about candles or lamps or fire or light, because I guarantee that some of you know things that I do not, and I want to learn from you just as much as you are learning from me. And a like if you are feeling generous, because likes are the fuel that keeps this channel burning, and without fuel even the best flame goes out. Now let me tell you about the craft of candle making itself, because the chandler, the professional candle maker, was one of the most important and most overlooked tradespeople in the medieval and early modern world. The chandler's workshop was not a pleasant place. The rendering of tallow was a hot, smelly, greasy business that produced fumes so powerful that chandlers were often required by municipal regulations to locate their workshops on the outskirts of town, downwind from the residential areas. The raw animal fat arrived at the workshop in barrels or baskets, often already several days old and beginning to go rancid, and the first task was to render it, to heat it slowly in large copper or iron cauldrons until the fat melted and separated from the connective tissue. The liquid tallow was then strained, allowed to cool slightly, and used for dipping or moulding candles while it was still warm and fluid. The chandler's skill lay in the details. The temperature of the tallow had to be precisely right, hot enough to flow smoothly, but not so hot that it would melt the previous layer when the wick was dipped again. The dipping had to be done at a steady, consistent pace, allowing each layer to cool just enough to solidify before the next dip. Too fast, and the layers would not bond properly and the candle would crack and crumble. Too slow, and the tallow would cool too much and the layers would be uneven and lumpy. A skilled chandler could produce candles that were smooth, straight and uniform, burning evenly from top to bottom. An unskilled chandler produced candles that were crooked, lumpy, and prone to guttering and smoking. And then there was the wick. The wick is the most important part of a candle, and for most of the history of candle making, the wick was the weakest link in the technology. The problem is simple to state, but fiendishly difficult to solve. The wick must draw liquid fuel upward into the flame. Too thick a wick, and it draws too much fuel, producing a large, smoky, wasteful flame that melts the candle faster than the fuel can be consumed, causing it to drip and puddle. Too thin a wick, and it does not draw enough fuel, producing a small, flickering flame that is prone to going out. And the wick must burn at the same rate as the fuel, so that the tip of the wick remains in the hottest part of the flame and does not extend beyond it. If the wick is too long, the tip extends beyond the flame and carbonizes, forming a hard, black, mushroom-shaped lump called a snuff, which causes the flame to gutter and smoke and the candle to drip. For most of the history of candle making, this problem was managed rather than solved. The wick was made from loosely twisted fibers, usually cotton or linen, that burned slowly and that could be trimmed periodically with a pair of special scissors called snuffers. Trimming the wick, which was called snuffing the candle, had to be done every 20 or 30 minutes to keep the flame burning cleanly, and it was one of the constant, irritating, never-ending chores of life in a candle-lit world. Every room had a pair of snuffers, every servant knew how to use them, and every evening was punctuated by the regular interruption of someone getting up, walking to the candle, trimming the wick, and sitting back down. The solution to the wick problem did not arrive until 1825, when a French chemist named Jean-Jacques Cambassers developed the braided wick. Instead of being loosely twisted, the braided wick is tightly plaited from 3 strands of cotton, and the plait is designed so that the wick curls slightly to one side as it burns. This curl pushes the tip of the wick to the edge of the flame, where it is consumed by oxidation instead of carbonizing into a snuff. A braided wick is self-trimming. It does not need to be snuffed. It does not form a mushroom. It does not cause guttering or smoking. It is, quite simply, the single most important innovation in the history of candle making, and it transformed the candle from a high-maintenance, constantly attended technology into a set-and-forget technology that could be lit and left to burn unattended for hours. But I am getting ahead of myself. The braided wick belongs to the 19th century, and we are still in the medieval period, still in a world where candles are made from tallow or beeswax, where wicks are loosely twisted and need constant trimming, where the quality of light available to most people is so poor that we would find it almost unbearable. Let me tell you what a medieval evening actually looked like, because I think it is important to feel it, not just understand it intellectually. The sun goes down. In the summer, sunset comes late, and the long twilight provides a gradual transition from day to night. But in the winter, in northern Europe, the sun sets at 4 in the afternoon, and by 5 o'clock the world is dark. Not dim. Dark. The kind of dark that you have never experienced. The kind of dark that presses against the windows and seeps under the doors and fills every corner and every shadow with an impenetrable blackness. Inside the house, the family gathers around the hearth. The fire provides most of the light. A warm orange flickering glow that illuminates the faces of the people closest to it and leaves the rest of the room in shadow. 1 or 2 tallow candles are lit, placed on the table in iron holders, their small yellowish flames adding a little extra illumination to the area immediately around them. The combined light of the fire and the candles is enough to see by, barely if you are sitting close to the source. But the corners of the room are dark. The ceiling is dark. The doorway is dark. And beyond the door, the world is utterly, completely, absolutely dark. You eat your evening meal by this light. You talk. You tell stories. You mend clothes or sharpen tools or do whatever small tasks can be done in near darkness with practiced hands. And you go to bed early, because staying awake after dark costs light, and light costs money, and money is something you do not have enough of. The cheapest tallow candle, the most basic, most minimal source of artificial light, costs about as much as a loaf of bread. If you burn 2 candles for 4 hours every evening, that is the equivalent of 2 loaves of bread per night, 14 loaves per week, simply for the privilege of being able to see after sunset. For a family living on the edge of subsistence, this is an expense that must be carefully managed, and the constant nagging awareness of the cost of light shapes every aspect of the evening routine. You go to bed when the candle goes out. That is not a metaphor. That is a literal description of how millions of people organized their evenings for hundreds of years. The candle was the clock. When it burned down to the stub, the evening was over. You lay down on your mattress in the darkness, and you closed your eyes, and you slept. Because there was nothing else to do. You could not read. You could not work. You could not see the faces of your family. You could only lie in the dark and listen to the sounds of the night and wait for dawn. And the darkness had its own rhythms and its own habits that we have completely lost. Historians have discovered that before the Industrial Revolution, before cheap artificial light became widely available, many people practiced what is called biphasic sleep. They did not sleep in one continuous block from bedtime to morning as we do today. They slept in 2 phases, separated by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. The first sleep began shortly after dark, lasted 3 or 4 hours, and was followed by a period of 1 to 2 hours of quiet wakefulness, during which people would lie in bed, think, pray, talk to their partner, or get up to their partner, or get up and do small tasks by the light of the embers. Then they would fall into their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This pattern of biphasic sleep has been documented in historical sources from across Europe, from the ancient world through the medieval period and into the early modern era. References to the first sleep and the second sleep appear in court records, diaries, medical texts, and literature, and they are so casual and so matter-of-fact that they clearly describe something that everyone understood and everyone practiced. It was only with the spread of cheap artificial light in the 18th and 19th centuries that the pattern changed, as people began to stay up later into the evening and compress their sleep into a single block. The candle did not just light the dark, it structured the dark. It determined when you went to bed and when you got up. It determined how long your evening lasted and what you could do during it. It determined the rhythm of your sleep and the texture of your nights. The candle was not just a light source, it was a timekeeper, a social organizer, a determinant of daily life. And the limitations of the candle, its dimness, its expense, its constant need for attention, shaped the lives of millions of people in ways that we, with our unlimited electric light, have completely forgotten. The candle burned down, the room went dark, and the medieval night began, long and deep and silent, filled with the sounds of breathing and the creak of timber and the distant howl of wind, a darkness so complete and so enveloping that it was almost a physical presence, something you could feel against your skin, something that weighed on your chest, something that weighed on your chest, something that wrapped around you like a blanket made of nothing. And somewhere in that darkness, in a monastery or a cathedral, a single beeswax candle still burned, the sanctuary lamp, the eternal light that was never ever allowed to go out, glowing in the darkness like a tiny golden star, a pinpoint of warmth and holiness in the vast, cold, godless night. The one light that never died, the one light that connected the sleeping world to the divine, the one light that said, even in the darkest hour, even in the longest night, someone is watching. Someone is watching. Someone is awake. The flame endures. But the flame was about to change, because, far to the north, in the cold, grey, storm-tossed waters of the Arctic Ocean, men were hunting an animal whose body contained a substance that would revolutionize the history of light. An animal that would burn brighter than tallow, cleaner than beeswax, and cheaper than either. An animal that would be hunted to the edge of extinction in the name of illumination. The whale was swimming, and the harpoons were being sharpened. There is a creature swimming in the dark ocean right now, as you lie here listening to this story. A creature so large that its heart is the size of a small car. A creature whose body contains enough oil to fill 2,000 wine bottles. A creature that dives to depths where no sunlight has ever reached, and holds its breath for 90 minutes, and communicates with other members of its species across distances of hundreds of miles, using sounds so deep and so powerful that they travel through the water, like slow thunder. This creature is the sperm whale, and for about 150 years between roughly 1700 and 1850, this creature was the most hunted animal on the face of the earth. Not for its meat, not for its bones, not for its skin, for the oil inside its head. Because that oil, when extracted and processed and poured into a lamp or molded into a candle, produced the finest artificial light that human beings had ever seen. Brighter than tallow, cleaner than beeswax, steadier than anything that had come before. The sperm whale was hunted across every ocean on the planet, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, from the coasts of Japan to the shores of Brazil, and tens of thousands of them were killed every year, their massive bodies stripped of blubber and boiled down on the decks of ships that stank of blood and oil and death, also that the drawing rooms and counting houses and street lamps of Europe and America could glow with a light that was just a little bit cleaner, just a little bit brighter, just a little bit cleaner, just a little bit better than what Kenan. This is the part of the history of light that most people do not know about. The part that involves blood. The part that involves an industry so vast and so brutal and so economically important that it shaped the foreign policies of nations and drove the exploration of the globe and created some of the largest fortunes in the history of commerce. The whaling industry was, for over a century, one of the biggest and most profitable businesses on Earth, and its primary product was not food, it was light. But let me start at the beginning, because the story of whale oil does not begin with the sperm whale. It begins with a much simpler, much less dramatic animal. The right whale. Right whales got their name from the whalers themselves. They were the right whale to hunt. They were slow. They were docile. They floated when they were dead, instead of sinking like some other species. And their blubber, the thick layer of fat beneath their skin that insulates them against the cold of the ocean, was rich in oil. When rendered, right whale blubber produced a clear, pale oil that burned reasonably well in lamps, brighter and cleaner than tallow, though not as clean as the best olive oil. Right whale oil was the first whale oil to be used widely for lighting, and it was being produced on a commercial scale by Basque whalers in the Bay of Biscay as early as the 11th century. But right whale oil had limitations. It had a noticeable fishy smell when it burned, not as bad as tallow, but not pleasant either. It produced a moderate amount of smoke. And as the right whale populations in the eastern Atlantic were hunted to near extinction by the 16th century, the supply became unreliable and the price rose. The whalers had to go farther and farther afield to find their prey. First the coasts of Newfoundland and Labrador, then to the Arctic waters around Spitsbergen and Jan Mayen, then to the South Atlantic and the Pacific. Each new hunting ground was farther from home, more dangerous, more expensive to reach. The voyages lasted months, sometimes years. The risks were enormous. Ships were crushed by ice, sunk by storms, lost in the vast emptiness of the ocean. And the whales, the supposedly inexhaustible whales, were getting harder to find. And then, sometime in the early 18th century, the whalers discovered the sperm whale. And everything changed. The sperm whale is not like other whales. It is larger. It is more aggressive. It is faster. It dives deeper. It fights back when harpooned, sometimes ramming the whaling boats with its massive head, smashing them to splinters. Hunting a sperm whale was genuinely dangerous work, and the whaling literature is full of stories of men killed by thrashing flukes, dragged under by tangled harpoon lines, crushed between the whale and the boat, or simply lost at sea when their small boat was overturned in the chaos of the hunt. The most famous of these stories, of course, is Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which is based on the real-life sinking of the whale ship Essex by a sperm whale in 1820. The Essex was rammed twice by a large bull sperm whale and sank in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, leaving its crew adrift in open boats for 91 days. 8 of the 20 crew members survived. The rest died of thirst, starvation, and exposure, and some of the survivors, driven mad by hunger, ate the bodies of the dead. This is what people were willing to endure for light. This is what the hunger for illumination drove men to do. They sailed to the other side of the world. They spent years at sea. They risked death by drowning, by whale, by starvation, by scurvy. And they did it because the substance inside the sperm whale's head was, pound for pound, the most valuable commodity in the lighting industry. That substance is called spermaceti. It is a waxy, oily liquid found in a large cavity in the sperm whale's head called the spermaceti organ, and nobody is entirely sure what biological purpose it serves. Some researchers believe it is involved in echolocation, helping the whale focus the clicking sounds it uses to navigate and find prey in the deep ocean darkness. Others believe it helps regulate buoyancy, solidifying in cold water to increase the whale's density for diving and liquefying in warm water to decrease density for surfacing. Whatever its natural function, its function for human beings was clear. When extracted from the whale's head and allowed to cool, spermaceti solidified into a hard, white, translucent wax that was unlike anything else in the natural world. Spermaceti candles were a revelation. They burned brighter than beeswax. They burned longer than beeswax. They produced a flame that was whiter and steadier than anything anyone had ever seen, a flame so consistent and so reliable that it was eventually adopted as the standard unit of luminous intensity. The candela, the base unit of luminous intensity in the International System of Units, was originally defined as the light emitted by a pure spermaceti candle burning at a specified rate. The standard of brightness against which all other light sources were measured was a candle made from the head of a whale. And spermaceti candles did not smell. They did not smoke. They did not drip. They held their shape in warm weather, unlike tallow, which softened and sagged in the summer heat. They were, in every technical sense, the finest candles ever made from a natural material, and their quality commanded a premium price that made the sperm whale the most economically valuable animal on Earth. The whaling industry that grew up around the sperm whale was centered in New England, particularly in the ports of Nantucket and New Bedford, Massachusetts. By the mid-19th century, New Bedford was one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States. Its grand houses and public buildings financed entirely by the profits of the whale oil trade. The whaling fleet out of New Bedford numbered over 300 ships, each one crewed by 20 to 30 men, each one capable of carrying thousands of barrels of oil. The ships sailed to every corner of the globe, hunting sperm whales in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic, and the Arctic. A typical voyage lasted 3 to 4 years, and a successful voyage could return with a cargo of oil worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. But the whaling industry was already doomed, even at the height of its prosperity. The sperm whale populations were declining. The voyages were getting longer and less profitable. The ships had to travel farther and stay out longer to fill their holds, and a new technology was emerging that would make whale oil obsolete almost overnight. That technology was gas. Now, the story of gaslighting begins not in a laboratory or a workshop, but in a coal mine. And it begins with an observation so simple that it is surprising nobody acted on it sooner. Coal, when heated in the absence of air, gives off a flammable gas. Miners had known this for centuries because the gas, which they called fire damp, was a constant hazard in underground mines, liable to ignite from the flame of a miner's lamp and cause devastating explosions. Fire damp was feared. Fire damp was deadly. Fire damp killed thousands of miners over the centuries. But fire damp was also, if you thought about it in the right way, free fuel. Free, flammable, burnable fuel produced in unlimited quantities by the simple act of heating coal. The first person to think about it in the right way was a Belgian chemist named Jan Pieter Minkelers, who in 1785 demonstrated that coal gas could be captured and used to light a room. But Minkelers did not pursue the idea commercially. The person who did, the person who transformed coal gas from a laboratory curiosity into a revolutionary lighting technology, was a Scottish engineer named William Murdoch. Murdoch was an employee of the Boulton and Watt Steam Engine Company, and in the 1790s, working in his home in Redruth, Cornwall, he began experimenting with the production and use of coal gas for lighting. He heated coal in a closed iron retort, collected the gas that was produced, piped it through tubes to burners in his house, and lit it. The result was a steady, bright, odorless flame that burned for as long as gas was supplied, without the need for wicks or wax or oil or any of the other paraphernalia of traditional lighting. In 1802, Murdoch installed gas lighting in the Boulton and Watt factory in Birmingham, making it one of the first buildings in the world to be lit by gas. The effect was dramatic. The factory, which had previously been lit by candles and oil lamps, was suddenly flooded with a bright, steady white light that transformed the working environment. Productivity increased. Working hours could be extended into the evening without the expense and inconvenience of hundreds of candles, and the workers, who had spent their careers laboring in the dim, smoky, flickering light of tallow candles, were amazed. But the real revolution came not in the factory but in the street, because gas could be piped. It could be produced at a central plant, stored in large tanks called gasometers, and distributed through a network of underground pipes to individual buildings and, crucially, to street lamps. And this meant something that had never been possible before in the entire history of human civilization. It meant that public spaces, streets, squares, parks, bridges, could be permanently illuminated at night, not by individual torches or lanterns carried by individuals, not by candles placed in windows, but by fixed, permanent, bright, reliable lights that burned all night, every night, maintained by a public utility and funded by public utility and funded by public taxes. The first gas-lit street in the world was Pall Mall in London, which was illuminated by gas lamps on January 28, 1807. The installation was the work of a German entrepreneur named Friedrich Albrecht Windsor, who had anglicized his name to Frederick Albert Windsor and who had been campaigning for years to convince the British government and the London public that gaslighting was safe, practical, and economically viable. The demonstration on Pall Mall was a sensation. Crowds gathered to stare at the bright, hissing blue-white flames that burned steadily in their glass-enclosed lanterns, casting a pool of light on the pavement below that was brighter and more consistent than anything the onlookers had ever seen in a public space. Within a decade, gaslighting had spread across London and was beginning to appear in other major cities across Britain and Europe. The Gaslight and Coke Company, founded by Windsor in 1812, was the world's first public utility company, and it laid the template for the utility model: centralized production, networked distribution, metered consumption that would later be adopted by the electricity industry and that remains the basis of how we distribute energy today. And the gaslit city was a new kind of city, a city that did not sleep, a city that did not shut down at sunset, a city that, for the first time in human history, had a nightlife. Before gaslighting, the streets of a city at night were dark, dangerous, and largely deserted. Respectable people stayed indoors after dark. The streets belonged to criminals, to drunks, to the homeless, and to the night watchmen who patrolled them with lanterns and clubs, calling out the hour and the weather. Going out at night was an act of courage or desperation. It was not entertainment. It was not leisure. It was something you did only if you had to, and you did it quickly and carefully and with one hand on your purse. Gaslighting changed all of that. The gaslit streets were safer. They were brighter. They were more inviting. And people began to use them. Shop owners discovered that they could stay open later if their shops and their storefronts were lit by gas. Restaurants and taverns and coffee houses discovered that evening trade could be as profitable as daytime trade. Theatres and music halls and pleasure gardens discovered that they could attract larger audiences if the streets leading to them were well lit and safe to walk. The gaslit city created the evening economy, the entire ecosystem of entertainment, dining, shopping, and socializing that we now take for granted as a normal feature of urban life. And gaslighting changed the nature of crime. It did not eliminate crime, obviously, but it changed where crime happened and what kind of crime was most common. Street robbery, which depends on darkness and surprise, became more difficult on well-lit streets, and crime rates in gaslit areas dropped measurably compared to unlit areas. But other kinds of crime, crimes that are facilitated by crowds and activity rather than by darkness and solitude, may have increased, because the gaslit streets attracted more people and more commerce and more opportunities for pickpockets and con artists and all the other parasites of the urban night. The relationship between light and crime is more complex than the simple equation. More light equals less crime would suggest. But the perception that gaslighting made the streets safer was widespread and powerful, and it was one of the main arguments used by advocates of public gaslighting to overcome the resistance of taxpayers and city councils who were reluctant to bear the expense. And now I want to tell you about one of the most romantic and most vanished figures in the history of the modern city. I want to tell you about the lamplighter. The lamplighter was the person responsible for lighting and extinguishing the gas street lamps every day. In the early days of gaslighting, before automatic ignition systems were developed, every gas lamp had to be lit individually, by hand, every evening at dusk, and extinguished every morning at dawn. The lamplighter walked a designated route through the streets, carrying a long pole with a small flame at the end, reaching up to each lamp in turn, opening the gas valve with a hook on the pole, and touching the flame to the gas jet. The whole operation took only a few seconds per lamp, but with dozens or hundreds of lamps on a typical route, the lamplighter's round could take an hour or more. The lamplighter was a familiar figure in the gaslit city, as much a part of the urban landscape as the postman or the policeman. Children would follow the lamplighter on his rounds, watching the lamps come to life one by one, each new flame adding its pool of light to the gathering dusk. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, wrote a famous children's poem about the lamplighter that captures the magic of the daily ritual. For we are very lucky with a lamp before the door, and Leary stops to light it as he lights so many more. Leary, the lamplighter, bringing light to the darkness, one lamp at a time, walking the streets at dusk like a secular priest performing a daily miracle. The lamplighter was, in a sense, the last in a long line of firekeepers that stretches all the way back to the Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome, the person whose job it was to keep the flames burning, to ensure that the light did not go out, to stand between the city and the darkness. And like the Vestal Virgins, the lamplighter was eventually made obsolete by technology. Automatic ignition systems, developed in the late 19th century, allowed gas lamps to be lit and extinguished by a clockwork mechanism or by a centrally controlled pressure system, eliminating the need for the lamplighter's daily rounds. And then electricity arrived, and the gas lamps themselves were made obsolete, replaced by the brighter, steadier, more efficient electric arc lamps and incandescent bulbs that would transform the urban night once again. But that transformation, the transformation from gas to electricity, is perhaps the most dramatic chapter in the entire history of light. And it involves a cast of characters, Edison and Swan and Tesla and Westinghouse, whose rivalries and innovations and failures and triumphs would reshape not just the technology of lighting, but the entire infrastructure of modern civilization. If you have been with me this far, if you have travelled from the cave painter's stone lamp through the stinking tallow candles of the Middle Ages, through the spermaceti candles of the whaling era, to the hissing gas jets of the Victorian city, then you know that this story is not just about light. It is about us. It is about what we are willing to do, what we are willing to kill, what we are willing to risk, what we are willing to pay for the simple privilege of being able to see in the dark. The sperm whale nearly went extinct because we wanted brighter candles. Entire cities were rebuilt, the streets torn up and relaid with gas pipes because we wanted lit streets. Thousands of men died in coal mines producing the gas that lit our homes. The cost of light, measured not in money, but in blood and suffering and ecological destruction, is staggering. And yet we paid it, willingly, eagerly, without hesitation, because the darkness was worse. And now we are going to meet the man who killed the darkness forever. The man who made light so cheap and so abundant and so effortless that we stopped thinking about it entirely. The man who gave us the light switch. And we are going to ask a question that almost nobody asks. A question that might seem absurd, but that is, I think, one of the most important questions of our time. What did we lose when we killed the dark? The answer might surprise you. Before electricity killed the darkness forever, before the light switch made miracles ordinary, before the modern world drowned itself in a flood of artificial light so vast and so constant that we forgot what the night sky looks like, there was a brief, strange, beautiful, violent chapter in the history of illumination that almost nobody remembers. A chapter that involved the blood of the earth itself. A liquid that had been lying beneath the ground for longer than human beings have existed, longer than mammals have existed, longer than mammals have existed, longer than dinosaurs have existed, formed from the compressed and heated remains of ancient marine organisms, tiny creatures that had lived and died and drifted to the bottom of prehistoric seas 300 million years ago and been slowly, patiently, in imaginable pressure and unimaginable heat and unimaginable plife, into something that would one day change everything. That liquid is petroleum, and the refined form of petroleum that bridged the gap between the age of fire and the age of electricity. The substance that brought affordable, bright, clean-burning illumination to hundreds of millions of people who had never in their lives had a reliable source of light. The substance that democratized illumination in a way that no previous technology had managed is called kerosene. And the story of how kerosene conquered the world and then lost it to something even more revolutionary is the story of how the modern world was born. Literally born. Because without kerosene, there would have been no petroleum industry. Without the petroleum industry, there would have been no internal combustion engine. Without the internal combustion engine, there would have been no automobiles, no airplanes, no modern transportation system. Kerosene was the first commercially successful petroleum product, the product that created the demand for oil drilling and oil refining and oil distribution that built the infrastructure on which the entire modern energy economy is based. The light that kerosene provided was not just illumination, it was the spark that ignited the petroleum age. And we are still living in that age for better and for worse. Right now, tonight, As you lie here in the dark listening to this story, the story of kerosene begins with a problem that was becoming urgent by the middle of the 19th century. The world was running out of whale oil. The sperm whale populations that had fueled the finest candles and the brightest lamps for over a century had been so thoroughly decimated by relentless industrial-scale hunting that the voyages were getting longer, the catches were getting smaller, and the price of spermaceti and whale oil was rising steadily year after year. The whaling fleet that had once numbered over 700 ships was shrinking. The ports that had grown wealthy from the trade, Nantucket and New Bedford and Sag Harbor, were beginning their long, slow decline. And the world's hunger for light was not declining with them. It was growing exponentially, driven by urbanization, by industrialization, by the spread of literacy, by the general increase in prosperity that was lifting millions of people out of subsistence poverty and into a world where they had both the means and the desire to illuminate their homes and their workplaces and their streets after the sun went down. The world needed a new source of light, something cheap, something abundant, something that could be produced in quantities sufficient to supply not just the drawing rooms of the wealthy, not just the workshops of the industrious, but the kitchens and bedrooms and barns and schoolrooms and churches and taverns and shops of ordinary people everywhere on the planet. Several candidates competed for this enormous and rapidly growing market. Camphene, a distillate of turpentine mixed with alcohol, burned brightly and was initially popular, but it was dangerously explosive. The vapor that accumulated above the liquid in a camphene lamp could ignite with a flash and a roar that turned the lamp into a bomb, spraying burning liquid across the room and setting everything it touched on fire. Hundreds of people were killed and thousands were injured in camphene lamp explosions in the 1840s and 1850s, and the fuel eventually acquired such a terrifying reputation that many cities banned its use entirely. Lard oil rendered from pig fat was cheap and widely available, but dim and smelly. Essentially a return to the tallow problem that people had been trying to escape for centuries. Coal oil, distilled from coal or oil shale through a process called destructive distillation, was more promising. It burned reasonably well and could be produced in moderate quantities. But the production process was expensive and energy-intensive. The supply of suitable coal and oil shale was geographically limited, and the resulting fuel had an unpleasant sulfurous odor that made it unpopular with consumers. None of these alternatives was good enough. None of them was cheap enough, clean enough, safe enough, and abundant enough to become the universal lighting fuel that the world was desperate for. And then, in 1853, a Canadian physician and geologist named Abraham Gesner changed the world with a patent. Gesner had been experimenting for years with the distillation of various hydrocarbons, and he had developed a process for refining a light, clear, flammable liquid from petroleum, a naturally occurring oily substance that seeped from the ground in certain locations and that had been known since antiquity, but had never been exploited on a commercial scale. Gesner called his refined product kerosene, from the Greek word kerosene meaning wax, because the liquid had a clarity and a viscosity that reminded him of melted candle wax. And kerosene was everything that the previous alternatives were not. It burned brightly, much brighter than whale oil or tallow or lard oil. It burned cleanly, producing far less smoke and soot than animal fats and far less odor than coal oil. It was liquid at room temperature, which made it easy to store and transport and pour into lamps. It had a reasonably high flash point, which made it safer than camphene, though still flammable enough to be dangerous if handled carelessly. And it was cheap. Not just a little cheaper than whale oil. Dramatically cheaper. Transformatively cheaper. The kind of cheaper that changes the economic equation so completely that it creates a new market where none existed before. But Gesner's kerosene was made from a raw material that was not yet available in large quantities. Petroleum, in the 1850s, was still a curiosity, a smelly nuisance that seeped from the ground in a few locations and that had been used in small amounts for medicinal purposes and as a lubricant, but had never been produced on an industrial scale. That changed on August 27, 1859, when Edwin Drake, a former railroad conductor with no experience in geology or engineering, successfully drilled the first commercial oil well near Titusville, Pennsylvania, striking oil at a depth of 69 feet. Drake's well was not deep. It was not technically sophisticated. It was, by the standards of modern drilling, almost comically primitive, but it proved a concept. It proved that petroleum could be extracted from the ground in commercial quantities by drilling, rather than simply collected from surface seeps. And the rush that followed Drake's discovery was one of the most explosive economic events of the 19th century. Within months, the hills around Titusville were covered with drilling rigs. Within years, the Pennsylvania oil fields were producing millions of barrels of crude petroleum annually. Refineries sprang up to process the crude oil into kerosene, and the kerosene was shipped by barrel, by rail, by river barge, and by wagon to every corner of the United States and beyond. The price of kerosene plummeted as production scaled up. Between 1860 and 1890, the cost of producing a given amount of light from kerosene dropped by roughly 90%. A gallon of kerosene, which could fuel a lamp for weeks, cost less than a tenth of what the equivalent amount of whale oil had cost a generation earlier. And the light it produced was better, brighter, more reliable. The kerosene lamp itself was a significant advance over the oil lamps and candles that had preceded it. The most common design, developed in the 1850s and refined over the following decades by dozens of inventors and manufacturers, consisted of a glass or metal reservoir for the kerosene, a flat or round wick that could be raised or lowered by a thumbscrew to adjust the flame height, a burner mechanism that held the wick at the correct position and allowed air to circulate around the flame, and a glass chimney that protected the flame from drafts and improved combustion by creating an updraft that drew fresh air through the burner. The glass chimney was a crucial innovation, far more important than it might seem. By enclosing the flame in a transparent cylinder, the chimney increased the oxygen supply to the flame, which made it burn hotter and brighter and more completely, reducing smoke and soot to a fraction of what a naked flame would produce. A kerosene lamp with a well-adjusted wick and a clean chimney produced a steady, bright, warm, golden light that was better than anything that had been available to ordinary people in the entire history of the world. And this is the moment when light became democratic. I want you to hold that word in your mind for a moment because it is the right word and it matters. Democratic. Before kerosene, bright, clean, reliable light was a luxury. Beeswax candles for the rich. Spermaceti candles for the very rich. Tallow candles and rushlights and crude fat lamps for everyone else. The amount of light you had in your home was a direct reflection of your social class, your income, your position in the hierarchy. Light was stratified. Light was unequal. Light was a marker of privilege. But kerosene was so cheap that virtually anyone could afford it. A farmer in Iowa, a shopkeeper in Ohio, a factory worker in Manchester, a peasant in Russia, a fisherman in Japan, a schoolteacher in rural India. For the first time in the entire history of the human species, bright, reliable, affordable artificial light was available to the masses, not just to the wealthy, not just to the urban, to everyone. And the effect on daily life was not just significant, it was revolutionary. People began to stay up later. This is such a simple statement that it is easy to overlook how profound it is. For 300,000 years, the length of the human day had been determined by the sun. When the sun was up, you were awake. When the sun went down, you went to sleep, or at least you retreated into the dim, restricted, candle-rationed twilight that was the best your ancestors could manage. But kerosene broke this equation. The evening, which had been a brief, dim, cramped interval between sunset and sleep, expanded into a substantial, well-lit period of productive and leisure time. 2 hours became 4 hours. 4 hours became 6 hours. The day got longer. Not the solar day. The human day. The amount of time available for work, for socializing, for learning, for thinking, for living, increased by hours every single day. And over a lifetime, those hours added up to years. Years of additional life, not in the biological sense, but in the experiential sense. Years of additional consciousness. Years of additional time in which to be human. Reading became a common evening activity. This is directly connected to the availability of cheap kerosene light, and the connection is not subtle. Before kerosene, reading after dark was expensive because it required candles, and it was physically difficult, because the light was dim and unsteady, and reading for extended periods by candlelight caused eye strain, headaches, and, over time, permanent damage to vision. Most people simply did not read after dark because it was not worth the cost and the discomfort. But a kerosene lamp produced enough light to read comfortably for hours, and the cost of the fuel was trivial. The explosion of popular literacy in the second half of the 19th century, the vast expansion of newspapers, novels, magazines, almanacs, educational texts, and all the other forms of printed material that transformed the intellectual life of the industrial world is directly connected to the fact that millions of people could now read after sunset without squinting or going blind or spending a fortune on candles. Homework became possible. And this is a detail that I find particularly moving because it connects the history of light to the history of opportunity in a way that is deeply personal and deeply consequential. Children who had previously been unable to study after dark because the family could not afford to burn candles for non-essential purposes could now sit at the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp and do their lessons. The expansion of public education in the late 19th century was facilitated by the expansion of domestic lighting. More light meant more learning meant more opportunity meant more social mobility. The kerosene lamp did not just illuminate rooms, it illuminated futures, and the children who studied by its light became the teachers and doctors and engineers and scientists and writers and politicians who built the 20th century. Domestic work was transformed. The women who had spent their evenings spinning and mending and cooking and cleaning by the dim, flickering light of tallow candles could now see what they were doing clearly and comfortably. The quality of needlework improved. The efficiency of food preparation improved. The general quality of domestic life improved. And the women themselves, freed from the eye strain and the frustration of working in near darkness, had more energy and more capacity at the end of the day, which meant more time for reading, for conversation, for engagement with the world beyond the household walls. The kerosene lamp was, in its quiet, unglamorous, thoroughly domestic way, a tool of women's empowerment. But kerosene had its problems, serious, sometimes deadly problems. The most immediate was fire. Kerosene is flammable. Not as explosive as camphene, but flammable enough to be dangerous, especially when handled carelessly or when used in poorly designed or poorly maintained lamps. Kerosene lamps were knocked over by children, by pets, by careless adults, by the simple accidents of daily life. Kerosene was spilled near open flames. Reservoirs cracked and leaked. Wicks were turned up too high, causing the flame to flare and ignite the fuel in the reservoir. And the resulting fires were devastating. In the decades between 1860 and 1900, kerosene lamp fires killed thousands of people and destroyed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property in the United States alone. The danger was so well known and so pervasive that insurance companies charged higher premiums for homes that used kerosene lighting, and municipal fire codes included specific detailed regulations about the storage, handling, and use of kerosene in residential buildings. And there was the soot. Kerosene lamps, while much cleaner than tallow candles, still produced soot. Not as much, but enough to gradually darken ceilings and walls and curtains and every other surface in a room where a kerosene lamp burned regularly. And there was the smell. Not as bad as tallow, not as bad as whale oil, but a faint, oily, petroleum odor that was noticeable in a closed room and that some people found unpleasant. And there was the carbon dioxide. And the carbon monoxide, in small amounts, if the combustion was incomplete, and the fine particulate matter that was inhaled with every breath in a kerosene-lit room, and that, over years of exposure, could contribute to respiratory problems. Kerosene was better than what came before, much better, but it was not perfect. It was a transitional technology, a bridge between the age of fire and the age of electricity, and the bridge was about to be crossed. Now I want to tell you about the man who crossed it. And I want to tell you something about him that the popular mythology usually gets wrong. Because the story of Thomas Edison and the electric light bulb is one of the most famous stories in the history of technology, and it is also one of the most misunderstood. The popular version goes like this. Thomas Edison, working alone in his laboratory, had a flash of genius and invented the light bulb in 1879. He flipped a switch, the bulb lit up, and the world was changed forever. This version is wrong in almost every particular. Edison did not work alone. He had a team of over 30 skilled experimenters, machinists and scientists at his Menlo Park laboratory. He did not have a flash of genius. He had a systematic, exhaustive, methodical, often tedious process of trial and error that involved testing thousands of materials over the course of more than a year. He did not invent the light bulb. The incandescent light bulb, the basic concept of passing an electric current through a thin filament inside a glass bulb until the filament glows white-hot and emits light, had been demonstrated by multiple inventors before Edison began his work. And what he created was not just a light bulb. It was something much more important and much more revolutionary than a light bulb. He created a system. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it is the key to understanding Edison's real genius and the real significance of his achievement. The incandescent light bulb by itself is useless. It is a glass ball with a wire inside it. Without electricity, it is a paperweight. And in 1879, electricity was not something that came out of a wall socket. There were no wall sockets. There were no power stations. There were no transmission lines. There were no transmission lines. There were no transformers. There were no meters. There were no switches. The entire infrastructure of electrical power, every single component of the system that delivers electricity to your home tonight, did not exist. Edison understood this. He understood it from the very beginning, before he had even solved the filament problem, and this understanding is what separates him from all the other inventors who were working on incandescent light at the same time. Joseph Swan in England had a working lamp. Humphrey Davy had demonstrated incandescence decades earlier. Dozens of other experimenters had produced glowing filaments in glass tubes, but none of them had thought beyond the bulb. None of them had asked the question that Edison asked, which was not how do I make a filament glow, but how do I light an entire city? Edison's approach to the filament problem was characteristic of his working method. It was not inspired. It was relentless. He and his team tested over 3,000 different materials as potential filaments. 3,000. They tested platinum, nickel, carbon, boron, silicon, and dozens of other elements and alloys. They tested carbon filaments made from every conceivable organic material: cotton thread, cardboard, fishing line, tissue paper, coconut shell, cedar bark, flax, hemp, horsehair, human hair, spider silk, bamboo, cork, celluloid, and hundreds of other substances. Each material was carbonized by heating it in the absence of air, sealed in a glass bulb from which the air had been pumped out by a mercury vacuum pump, connected to a battery, and tested. How bright did it glow? How long did it last? How much current did it draw? How much did it cost? The breakthrough, when it came, was not dramatic. It was incremental. On October 21, 1879, Edison tested a filament made from a piece of carbonized cotton thread, and it burned for 13.5 hours. This was longer than any previous filament had lasted, but it was not, by any objective measure, a practical result. 13 hours is less than a day. A candle lasted longer than that, but it was enough to demonstrate the principle, enough to show that a practical, commercially viable incandescent lamp was possible. Edison continued refining the filament over the following months, testing hundreds more materials, and eventually settled on carbonized bamboo, which could burn for over 1,200 hours. 1,200 hours. 50 days of continuous burning. That was a practical lamp. But the lamp was only the beginning, because Edison was not trying to sell light bulbs. He was trying to sell light. And selling light required building the entire system that would generate electricity, transmit it through wires, deliver it to individual buildings, and convert it into illumination at the point of use. Edison designed and built every component of this system himself, or rather, his team at Menlo Park designed and built it, because Edison, for all his genius, was a leader and a manager and a systems thinker, not a solitary inventor working in isolation. They designed generators, they designed wiring, they designed junction boxes and fuse boxes and switches and sockets and meters, they designed the insulation for the underground cables. They designed the chandeliers and the wall sconces and the desk lamps that would hold the bulbs. Every component had to be compatible with every other component. Every component had to be safe and reliable and affordable. The whole system had to work as a whole, seamlessly, invisibly, so that the end user, the person in the house or the office or the shop, experienced nothing but the simple, effortless miracle of the switch. Click. Light. The Edison Electric Illuminating Company, founded in 1880, built the first commercial power station in the United States. The Pearl Street Station, located in Lower Manhattan, began generating electricity on September 4, 1882. The station contained 6 dynamo generators, each one driven by a steam engine, and it powered a network of underground copper cables that delivered electricity to 85 customers in a 1-square-mile area of downtown Manhattan, powering approximately 400 incandescent lamps. It was a tiny beginning, 85 customers, 400 lamps, 1 square mile, but it was the beginning of everything. The first electric nights was something that the people who experienced them never forgot. The accounts from the 1880s and 1890s are remarkably consistent in their tone of astonishment and wonder, and, sometimes, unease. The electric light was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. It was brighter than any flame that had ever burned. It was steadier than any flame. It did not flicker. It did not dance. It did not respond to drafts or air currents. It did not respond to drafts or air currents. It did not smoke. It did not smell. It did not need trimming or refueling or adjusting. It did not gradually dim as the fuel was consumed. It just burned, steadily, relentlessly, unchangingly, for as long as the electricity flowed, with a constancy and a reliability that seemed almost supernatural, and the quality of the light was different from anything that had come before. It was whiter, cooler, harder, the warm, golden, gentle light of flames, the light that had illuminated every human activity for 300,000 years, was being replaced by something that was technically superior, but emotionally different. The worn light of candles and gas had softened the world. It had hidden imperfections. It had rounded edges. It had made faces look younger, and rooms look cozier, and the night feel more intimate. The electric light did none of these things. It revealed. It exposed. It showed the world as it actually was, without the flattering filter of firelight. Some people loved it. They marveled at the clarity, the brightness, the sheer practical utility of being able to see clearly in every corner of a room. Others hated it. Robert Louis Stevenson described the new electric streetlights as a lamp for a nightmare. Other writers called the light ghastly, corpse-like, surgical, unnatural. There was a genuine cultural tension between the old light and the new, between the romantic warmth of gas and candle and the cold efficiency of electricity. And that tension persisted for decades, well into the 20th century, until the electric light became so universal and so normalized that people forgot there had ever been anything else. The spread of electric lighting was one of the fastest technology adoptions in human history. In 1882, there were a few hundred electric lamps in Lower Manhattan. By 1890, there were hundreds of thousands across the United States and Europe. By 1900, there were millions. By 1920, electric lighting was standard in most urban areas of the developed world, and it was spreading rapidly into suburban and rural areas as well. By 1950, the majority of the population in industrialized countries had electric light in their homes. And today, electric light is so universal, so ubiquitous, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern life that we literally cannot imagine living without it. It is the air we breathe, the water we swim in, the invisible, omnipresent, unnoticed foundation of everything we do. And this is where the story takes its final turn. Because we have reached the end of the technological journey, the journey from the cave painter's stone fat lamp to the LED bulb on your bedside table, from the flickering, smoking, stinking flame that held back the darkness for a few hours to the steady, cool, limitless, effortless light that fills your world 24 hours a day. The problem that our ancestors faced for 300,000 years, the problem of the dark, has been solved. Solved so completely and so thoroughly that we have forgotten it was ever a problem at all. But there is a cost, There is always a cost, and the cost of solving the problem of darkness is something that we are only now, in the early decades of the 21st century, beginning to understand. The cost is darkness itself. We have killed the dark. I do not mean that metaphorically. I mean it literally. The natural darkness that our ancestors knew. The darkness that shaped their biology and their psychology and their culture and their spirituality. That darkness no longer exists for the majority of the human population. It has been replaced by a perpetual, low-level, inescapable glow that bleeds from our cities and our suburbs and our highways and our parking lots and our stadiums and our shopping centres and our shopping centres and our billboards and our signs and our screens into the atmosphere, scattering off dust and moisture particles and creating a dome of diffused artificial light that extends for miles in every direction from every populated area on the planet. The night sky that our ancestors looked up at, the sky that inspired them to create constellations and mythologies and calendars and navigation systems and religions. The sky that contained the Milky Way, that vast luminous river of stars that stretches from horizon to horizon on a clear, dark night. That sky is gone. Gone for the majority of the human population. Gone so completely that most people alive today have never seen it. The International Dark Sky Association estimates that roughly 80% of the world's population lives under light-polluted skies, and that roughly 1/3 of humanity cannot see the Milky Way at all. 1/3. 2.5 billion people. 2.5 billion people who've never looked up and seen the galaxy in which they live, or have never experienced the awe, the wonder, the humbling, terrifying, beautiful realization that they are standing on a tiny rock floating in an ocean of stars so vast and so ancient that the human mind cannot comprehend it. We traded the stars for the light switch, and we did it without thinking, without noticing, without asking whether the trade was worth it. And the loss is not just aesthetic. It is not just about the beauty of the night sky, though that beauty is real, and its loss is a genuine impoverishment of the human experience. The loss is biological, it is ecological, it is medical, and the science documenting these effects is growing rapidly and is deeply concerning. Artificial light at night disrupts the circadian rhythms of human beings. The circadian rhythm is the internal biological clock that regulates sleep, wakefulness, hormone production, body temperature, metabolism, immune function, and dozens of other physiological processes. This clock is calibrated by light, specifically by the cycle of light and dark that corresponds to day and night. When that cycle is disrupted, when the body is exposed to artificial light during the hours when it expects darkness, the clock malfunctions. Melatonin production is suppressed. Melatonin is a hormone that is essential for sleep initiation and sleep quality, and that also has antioxidant and anti-cancer properties. Cortisol production is disrupted. Cortisol is the stress hormone, and its dysregulation is linked to anxiety, depression, weight gain, and cardiovascular disease. The entire hormonal cascade that governs the body's daily cycle of activity and rest is thrown out of alignment, and the consequences, accumulated over years and decades of chronic exposure to artificial light at night, are serious. Studies have linked chronic exposure to nighttime artificial light with increased rates of breast cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, and immune dysfunction. The World Health Organization has classified nighttime shift work, which involves chronic exposure to artificial light at night, as a probable human carcinogen. The evidence is not definitive for all of these conditions, but it is strong enough and consistent enough to have attracted the attention of public health researchers around the world. And the consensus is growing that our 24-hour artificially illuminated lifestyle is making us sick in ways that we are only beginning to understand. And the effects on wildlife are even more dramatic and more immediate. Migratory birds which navigate by the stars are disoriented by the glow of cities and crash into illuminated buildings by the hundreds of millions every year. The toll in North America alone is estimated at between 300 million and 1 billion bird deaths annually from collisions with lit buildings and structures. sea turtle hatchlings which instinctively crawl toward the brightest horizon, which in a natural environment would be the ocean reflecting the moon and stars, are drawn instead toward the lights of beachfront hotels and coastal roads, where they are killed by traffic, by dehydration, by exhaustion, or by predators that find them exposed on the open sand, far from the water they were trying to reach. Insects, which are attracted to artificial light sources in vast numbers, swarm around street lamps and porch lights and illuminated signs, exhausting themselves, abandoning their feeding and mating and pollinating activities, disrupting the food chains that depend on them. The global decline in insect populations, which has been described by researchers as an ecological catastrophe unfolding in real time, is driven by many factors, pesticides and habitat loss chief among them. But artificial light at night is a significant and growing contributor. Coral reefs are affected. The spawning cycles of many coral species are triggered by moonlight, and artificial light from coastal development disrupts these cycles, reducing reproductive success. Fish are affected. Many fish species use the natural cycle of light and dark to regulate feeding, spawning, and migration, and artificial light at night disrupts all of these behaviors. Frogs are affected. Their mating calls, which are timed to the natural light cycle, are disrupted by artificial light. Bats are affected. Some species avoid artificially lit areas entirely, reducing their foraging habitat, while others are attracted to the insect swarms around lights, altering their natural distribution and behavior. Trees are affected. Artificial light at night can delay the shedding of leaves in autumn and advance the budding of leaves in spring, disrupting the seasonal cycles that trees depend on for dormancy and growth. The web of ecological disruption caused by artificial light at night is vast and interconnected and still poorly understood, because the research is relatively new and the effects are subtle and cumulative and difficult to isolate from the many other environmental stresses that modern ecosystems face. But the picture that is emerging is clear enough to be alarming. We are not just illuminating the night. We are dismantling it. We are taking apart, piece by piece, the ancient cycle of light and dark that every living thing on this planet, including us, evolved under and depends on. And this is not a story of villainy. Nobody set out to destroy the night sky. Nobody intended to disrupt the migration of birds or the spawning of corals or the circadian rhythms of human beings. The people who built the first gas lamps and the first power stations and the first streetlights were solving a real problem. A problem that had plagued humanity for 300,000 years. The darkness was dangerous. The darkness was limiting. The darkness kept people poor and ignorant and afraid. The light was liberation. The light was progress. The light was progress. The light was civilization. And the people who brought the light were heroes. Every one of them. From the cave painter who first filled a stone bowl with reindeer fat, to the lamplighter who walked the streets of Victorian London with his long pole and his tiny flame, to the engineer who threw the switch at the Pearl Street station. But the heroes did not know what they were losing. They could not know. They could not see the future. They could not predict the consequences. They could not imagine a world so saturated with artificial light that the stars would disappear and the birds would lose their way and the turtles would crawl toward the hotels and the insects would exhaust themselves, circling bulbs until they died. They could not imagine that the darkness they were fighting, the darkness they feared, the darkness they hated with every fiber of their 300,000-year-old primate brains, was also something precious, something necessary. Something that human beings and all other living things on this planet need as much as they need light. And this, I think, is the deepest lesson of the entire history of candles and lamps. It is not that progress is bad. It is not that we should go back to tallow candles and rushlights and stone fat lamps. That would be absurd. The light has given us everything. Literacy, education, safety, productivity, freedom, the ability to live our lives on our own schedule, rather than the sun's schedule, the ability to see in the dark, which is, when you think about it clearly, one of the most extraordinary things our species has ever achieved. We should not give that up. We should never give that up. But we should understand what it cost. We should acknowledge the trade-off. We should recognize that every solution creates new problems, that every triumph has a shadow, that every light we turn on somewhere makes the darkness a little deeper somewhere else. And we should think carefully and honestly about how much light we actually need, and where we need it, and when we need it, and when we need it, and whether we can find ways to illuminate our lives without extinguishing the night. Because the night is not just the absence of light. The night is an ecosystem. The night is a biological necessity. The night is a source of wonder and beauty and spiritual sustenance that our ancestors understood intuitively and that we have lost so thoroughly that most of us do not even know it is missing. The night is the other half of the world, and we have been pretending it does not exist. If you have been here for this entire journey, from the first part to this final one, if you have travelled with me from the cave painter's stone lamp through the stinking tallow candles of the Middle Ages, through the spermaceti candles of the whaling era, through the gaslit streets of Victorian London, through the kerosene revolution, through the electric miracle to this moment, right now, lying in the dark, thinking about light and darkness and the long, tangled, beautiful, bloody, surprising history that connects the two, then I want to thank you, not with a formula, not with a scripted sign-off, with genuine, heartfelt gratitude, because you gave me something tonight that I cannot take for granted. You gave me your attention, your time, your willingness to slow down and think about something that most people never think about. And in a world that is drowning in noise and speed and distraction and yes, in light, that gift is more precious than you know. And now I want to ask you for 3 things before the darkness takes you. First, subscribe. Because this story is not the only story I have to tell. The history of candles and lamps is just one thread in an enormous tapestry of everyday history that stretches across thousands of years and touches every aspect of human life. The history of bread, the history of doors, the history of shoes, the history of mirrors, the history of soap, the history of chairs, the history of clocks, the history of windows, the history of clocks, the history of keys, the history of cups. Every one of these objects has a story as rich and as surprising and as deeply human as the story of light. And I want to tell all of them. One by one. Slowly. Carefully. With the same attention and the same respect that I have tried to bring to tonight's story. Subscribe and you will be here for every one of them. Second, leave a comment. Tell me what you learned tonight that you did not know before. Tell me which part of the story surprised you the most. Was it the cave painter's stone lamp made from reindeer fat? The theological reason why the church required beeswax candles? The fact that the standard unit of brightness was originally defined by a candle made from the wax inside a whale's head? The fact that we used to sleep in 2 phases before artificial light compressed our nights into a single block? The fact that 80% of the world's population can no longer see the Milky Way? Tell me, because your reactions are my compass. They tell me where the most interesting parts of the story are. They tell me what to explore next. And they tell me that these quiet stories, these unglamorous stories about ordinary objects that nobody notices, actually matter to someone. And third, share this with someone who needs it tonight. Someone who is lying awake right now, staring at the ceiling, reaching for their phone in the darkness, scrolling through an endless feed of short, loud, forgettable content, looking for something, anything, that will quiet their mind and slow their breathing and carry them gently toward sleep. Send them this. Not because it is better than what they are watching, but because it is different, because it is slow, because it takes its time, because it asks them to think about something they have never thought about before, because it connects them to a history that is their history, the history of every human being who has ever lit a candle or trimmed a wick or watched a flame or looked up at the stars and wondered. And if you want more, if this journey has awakened something in you that is not ready to sleep just yet, then I have other journeys waiting for you, right here on this channel. Stories about lost cities that time forgot. Stories about how empires quietly began from seeds planted in the dirt. Stories about what a real day in a medieval village actually looked like, from the cold darkness of dawn to the warm darkness of bedtime. Each one is as long and as detailed and as immersive as the one you just experienced. Each one will carry you into a different world and a different time, and each one is designed to do exactly what this one has done tonight. To slow you down, to quiet your mind, to make the modern world with all its noise and speed and relentless, blinding, omnipresent, never-ending light fade away for a little while, and to replace it with something older and stranger and gentler and more beautiful. Go there now, or save them for tomorrow night. They will be waiting. Stories are patient. They've been waiting for thousands of years. They can wait one more night. And now, let me bring you back to where we started. To the dark room. To the hand reaching for the light switch. To the miracle that you perform every day without knowing it is a miracle. The next time you flick that switch, pause. Just for a second. Just long enough to feel the weight of the history behind it. 300,000 years of darkness. 15,000 years of stone lamps and animal fat. 2,000 years of candles and oil lamps. 200 years of gas and kerosene. 140 years of electricity. Millions of whales killed. Thousands of miners buried. Billions of dollars spent. Countless hours of human ingenuity and human suffering and human hope, all distilled into a single, silent, instantaneous act. Click, and the light comes on. And the darkness, the ancient, primordial, 300,000-year-old darkness that your ancestors feared more than anything else in the world, the darkness that shaped their bodies and their minds and their religions and their art and their architecture and their social structures and their sleep patterns and their very DNA. That darkness vanishes in an instant, without effort, without thought, without gratitude, without even noticing that a miracle has occurred. But tonight you know. Tonight, lying here in the dark, you know what your ancestors knew. You know that the darkness is real. You know that the light is precious. You know that someone, somewhere, at every moment of every day for the last 300,000 years has been tending a flame, feeding it, protecting it, passing it on, from the cave painter to the chandler to the lamplighter to the engineer, to the person who, tonight, left the porch light on so that someone coming home late could find their way to the door. The history of light is the history of love, not romantic love, not sentimental love, the deepest, oldest, most fundamental kind of love there is. The love that says, I will not let you be alone in the dark. I will keep the flame burning. For you. For us. For everyone who comes after us. The flame will endure. It has always endured. Close your eyes now. Let the darkness in. The good darkness. The safe darkness. The warm, gentle, ancient darkness of sleep and rest and dreams. You have earned it. You have travelled far tonight. From the cave to the cathedral to the whaling ship to the gaslit street to the power station to the starless sky. You have seen the whole story. The whole long, quiet, extraordinary story of how human beings learned to hold fire in their hands and carry it through the dark. And somewhere tonight, on the other side of the world, the sun is rising, and somewhere else the sun is setting, and somewhere else someone is lighting a lamp, and somewhere else someone is flipping a switch, and somewhere else a child is looking up at the sky and seeing, for the first time, a single bright star through a gap in the clouds, and asking the question that every child has asked since the beginning of time. What is that light? And the answer is the same answer it has always been. It is the fire. It is always the fire. Good night. Dream of flames and stars and the long, beautiful, unbroken chain of light that connects you to every human being who has ever lived. The flame endures. Sleep well.